So, what awaits the crew of the most mass-produced and, at the same time, most destroyed tank of World War II when it takes a direct hit? Spoiler alert: nothing good. The chances of getting out of the vehicle before it turned into a fireball were, to put it mildly, slim. Today we're going to talk about exactly that, as well as some of the lesser-known details about the T-34 that are definitely worth your attention. Let's go back to the very origins of the tank that would change the rules of armored warfare. You could say it all started when Stalin came to power. He asked his generals a question: what military doctrine would prevent the catastrophic defeats of the past? The answer he liked most was the concept of deep battle. To put it simply, it's the idea that a massive, technologically advanced army should crush the enemy with a swift and decisive blow, without giving them a chance to react. To implement this doctrine, Stalin launched a program of forced industrialization to arm his military, which, truth be told, remained poorly equipped even after it was over. You can only imagine what it was like before. But there was a serious problem with tanks. The country lacked the necessary technology and manufacturing base. They had purchased some British Vickers tanks and a license for the American tank designed by Walter Christie, but they never went into mass production. Using the British design as a basis, they created the T-26 tank, while the American design gave birth to the BT series of fast-moving light tanks. They were produced in huge numbers, but with another global conflict looming, it was obvious that these machines, with their paper-thin armor, wouldn't be able to decide the outcome of future battles. This was clearly proven in 1938 during the battles at Lake Khasan, where Japanese forces knocked out Soviet tanks with little effort. And a few years later, at the start of Operation Barbarossa, the Wehrmacht would literally grind them to dust. While this was happening, new projects were already in development, but the world knew almost nothing about them. The Germans had heard rumors of the KV-1 heavy tank, which was invulnerable to their early anti-tank guns, but its numbers weren't large enough to be a major concern. They had no idea the T-34 even existed. Even before the war, the T-34 was slowly taking shape through a process of trial and error. An engineer named Mikhail Koshkin, tasked with creating the A-20, an upgraded version of the BT tank, pushed forward a concept that was pretty unorthodox for the time. He was convinced the old path was a dead end, and despite initial skepticism from his superiors, he proposed a better idea. This was the A-32 project, with a 76mm gun instead of a 45mm, along with improved armor and suspension. He managed to prove he was right during testing, and after it was approved, the project was given a new name, the T-34. The Soviet leadership, much like the Americans with their Shermans, wanted a reliable, easy-to-produce, universal platform. The tank had to be effective enough and built in such numbers that it would compensate for any of its shortcomings. The concept was deemed a success, and the tank quickly went into production, receiving upgrades along the way. For a tank of the 1930s, 60-degree sloped armor and a high-velocity 76mm gun were revolutionary. But its first drawback became apparent immediately. The turret design was a holdover from earlier plans that called for a smaller gun. The first T-34s used a two-man turret originally intended for a 45mm weapon. Trying to cram a larger 76mm gun and its ammunition into that space made the commander's and loader's stations incredibly cramped. The commander also had to act as the gunner, as there was simply no room for a dedicated gunner in that tiny turret. This would later prove to be a major ergonomic flaw. But in 1940, the top priority was to build a powerful tank quickly, so this problem was left for future crews to deal with. Before mass production began, its designer, Mikhail Koshkin, decided to prove his machine's exceptional reliability. He organized an extreme test drive of 2 T-34 prototypes along a route from Kharkiv to Moscow, covering about 2,000 kilometers. Since the project was top secret, the column avoided public roads, traveling mostly through snow and spring mud. When the mud-caked tanks were presented to the Soviet leadership near Moscow, it shut down any doubts from the critics. However, this story had a tragic ending. During this winter journey, Koshkin, who often rode on the tank's armor, caught a cold and developed pneumonia. He stubbornly stayed with his crew for the return trip, but his health rapidly deteriorated. In September 1940, Mikhail Koshkin passed away, never living to see what his creation was capable of in combat. Then again, he probably wouldn't have been happy to learn just how poorly the Soviets used these tanks at the start of the war. Fast forward to June 1941. The Wehrmacht's powerful thrust is crushing everything in its path. The light tanks of the Red Army were swept aside by German panzers, and it looked as though the Soviet Union would collapse within weeks. But as the Germans pushed deeper into Soviet territory, they were in for a nasty surprise, in the form of a tank they never knew existed. At that point, the T-34s were scattered among Red Army tank units and weren't yet numerous. Only about 1,000 were in service. Their first encounter with the Germans left them in shock. Their main anti-tank weapon at the time, the 37mm gun, both towed and mounted on the Panzer IV, was completely useless against the T-34. Shells ricocheted off the sloped armor, even at point-blank range. There are reports of a single tank taking over 20 hits before a shell finally found a weak spot and disabled it. Even the new 50mm anti-tank gun, which was being fitted to the Panzer III, struggled to penetrate the T-34's frontal armor, while its 76mm gun could easily destroy any German tank of the period. And here we should ask the question that historian Nicholas Moran once posed. Why did a T-34 take 20 hits before being knocked out? Why didn't its crew neutralize the threat after, say, 5 shots? It seems like they were just sitting there, taking hit after hit until a shell jammed their turret, at which point they'd abandon the tank. Why were they almost always, eventually, knocked out? And why could the Germans get off at least 3 accurate shots for every 1 fired from a T-34? After all, the Soviet tank had superior armor, mobility, and firepower. But it did little more than frustrate the Germans until they got their 75mm PaK-40 gun. By the way, the Germans also used their 88mm anti-aircraft guns, but there weren't many of them at this stage. The answer is simple. Soviet tankers couldn't see the battlefield and weren't trained well enough to use the full advantages of what was supposed to be a superior tank. We've already mentioned how cramped the turret was. Now, take a look at this hatch. A single, one-piece hatch for both crew members in the turret, which required superhuman strength to open. On top of that, the barely trained commander had to simultaneously act as the gunner, command the tank, and monitor the battlefield from a turret with terrible visibility. Practical training at tank schools lasted literally a couple of hours. Radios were also a rarity. Usually, only the platoon commander's tank had one. The rest communicated with signal flags, or, in practice, simply followed the lead tank and did whatever it did. German reports describe Soviet tanks charging into battle without any plan, bunching up, unable to tell where fire was coming from, and returning wildly inaccurate shots. Oh, and their optics were terrible compared to the Germans. During his numerous purges, Stalin had eliminated a significant portion of the Red Army's officer corps. So, at that point, despite having a reasonably good tank for its time, the Soviet crews simply couldn't leverage its strengths. Add to that transmission problems, fuel and ammo shortages, and the general chaos the Red Army was in. The Germans were bombing factories, so spare parts were hard to come by. Many T-34s had to be abandoned or destroyed. In 1941 alone, over 2,000 of them were lost. In fact, during the initial period of the war, more T-34s were lost to non-combat causes than to enemy action. So, the myth of their invincibility that arose after their first appearance was quickly shattered. But the real story of the T-34 was yet to come, and that didn't mean life would get any easier for its crews. By the fall, the Wehrmacht was at the gates of Leningrad and Moscow. You can see how deep they had penetrated, and the Soviet Union faced a very real threat of collapse. However, 2 factors prevented this, and the T-34 played a key role. First, huge reserve armies that had been held back near Moscow were thrown into the defense. Second, the Soviet Union shifted to a total war footing, making national defense the absolute priority, which had a massive impact on tank production. But to make that production possible, the factories had to be moved to a safe location, far from German air raids and the risk of being overrun. Entire factories were dismantled, loaded onto trains, and shipped beyond the Ural Mountains to Siberia and Kazakhstan. Just look at a map to get a sense of how far that was. Basically, into the middle of nowhere. With them went tens of thousands of workers and their families, whose sole purpose for the next few years became the mantra, work, sleep, repeat. Around the clock, for several years, these factories produced tanks and war materials, which were immediately loaded onto trains and sent to the front. The cost of this was a complete halt in tank production for over a month as the factories were being moved. And when production restarted, it took time for the plants to coordinate and ensure the three main T-34 production lines were all doing the same thing in the same way. This left its mark on the battlefield. However, once the factories were set up, far from any possible German attack, they could churn out an incredible number of tanks without interruption. At peak production, they were pushing out 1,200 T-34s per month. For comparison, the Germans produced a little over 8,000 Panzer IVs in about 6 years. The Soviet factories did that in 6 months. The T-34's design was simplified even further, reducing the number of parts. Armor plates were cut to be welded faster. The turret was replaced with a cast hexagonal design, and everything that wasn't absolutely necessary to drive, shoot, and protect was stripped out. For example, the padding for the driver's seat. He'd be wearing a thick winter coat anyway, or he could sit on it in the summer. So you see, through its wartime evolution, the T-34 would end up with roughly twice the armor thickness and double the penetration power, all while its production cost was cut by about 40%. It might be a point made in many documentaries, but this ease of production and the sheer numbers were a critical factor in how the war was actually fought. As more tanks reached the front, tactics and crew training finally began to improve. The mindless charges without artillery support and reconnaissance were stopped, and armor finally began to be used as it should be. The Soviets became masters of the counterattack, overrunning German positions with sheer speed and mass. First would come a heavy artillery barrage, and the moment it lifted, it was followed by a combined tank and infantry charge. Losses were still high, but these attacks struck terror into the hearts of German soldiers. Radios, once a luxury, became standard equipment. While still crude by Western standards, it was a huge step forward. When it came to taking a hit, the T-34 had several serious problems for its crew. Let's start with the armor. Soviet armor was very hard, but because of that, it was also brittle. Even a non-penetrating hit could cause internal spalling. This is when pieces of armor break off from the inside surface, turning into shrapnel that flies right into the crew's faces. But you were most likely to get hit by one of the German high-velocity anti-tank guns, and in that case, spalling was the least of your worries. German guns, from the Pak-40, the 75mm gun also mounted on Panzer IVs and assault guns, on up, were more than capable of penetrating any Allied tank, even at long range. Additionally, unlike the solid-shot shells used by the Allies, German shells contained an explosive filler. So, besides an armor-piercing core blasting its way into your tank, it would also explode inside. This brings us to the next big problem, ammunition, and to every tanker's greatest fear, fire. Shells for the main gun were stored in racks along the hull sides, on the floor, and in a few ready racks in the turret. There was no standardized, wet stowage like in later Sherman models to reduce the chance of the ammo catching fire after a hit. To make matters worse, for some reason, Soviet ammunition was much more prone to igniting. When the fighting moved into urban areas, the biggest threat became the Panzerfaust. It was a short-range and fairly inaccurate weapon, but if it hit a tank, the shaped charge jet would melt through the armor and spray the inside of the tank. Just imagine red-hot molten metal spraying all over you. It burns through clothes and, well, everything underneath them. It also ignites ammunition instantly. And the Germans produced more than 8 million Panzerfausts during the war, so they were everywhere in huge numbers. In the later stages of the war, Panzerfausts were responsible for around 70% of destroyed tanks, and they actually killed more crew members per destroyed tank than anti-tank guns did because of the way they worked. T-34 crews did at least get 2 hatches on the turret instead of a single, super heavy one, which were much easier to open in an emergency. The driver, however, who sat in an awkward position behind the sloped front plate, had a hatch that opened forward. In a fire, he would most likely try to escape through the turret if he could, because opening and then climbing out of his own hatch was extremely difficult, even under normal conditions. Not to mention, the hatch could get jammed after a hit. All of this contributed to Soviet tankers having a much higher number of men killed per destroyed tank. In the American Sherman, which was often called a death trap, there was actually about 1 crewman killed per knocked-out tank. The Soviets had 2, and they had a 4-man crew, while the Sherman had 5. So they basically had a 50% chance of getting out. And according to some other sources, this number could be as low as 20%. Oh, and we haven't even mentioned the poor bow gunner in the early T-34s. He didn't have a hatch at all, and his only view was through a tiny slit next to his machine gun. Luckily, he was removed in later models. Speaking of later models, we have to mention the T-34-85. The Germans deployed their heaviest tanks for the first time and in the largest numbers on the Eastern Front. The Soviets were the first to face the Tiger, Panther, King Tiger, and super heavy tank destroyers like the Ferdinand and later the Jagdpanther. So they quickly realized that the T-34's 76mm gun wasn't going to cut it for much longer. Because of this, the T-34-85 was introduced in 1944, solving the previous model's biggest problems: its firepower and its 2-man turret. The new turret now housed an 85mm gun, adapted from a Soviet anti-aircraft cannon. Similar to what the Germans did with their 88mm flak gun, it had the high muzzle velocity and armor penetration needed to take on the new German behemoths. As a nice side benefit, it also fired more powerful high-explosive rounds for use against other targets. But the real improvement was the redesigned turret. It was finally large enough for the gun and 3 people, introducing a dedicated loader and gunner to handle the weapon. This freed the commander from his other duties so he could focus on commanding the battle. Visibility was also improved with a proper commander's cupola with all-around periscopes. This significantly increased combat effectiveness, or rather, it reduced the ineffectiveness of the early T-34, although the tank was still far from ergonomic, spacious, or comfortable. Handrails were also welded onto the exterior for infantry to hold onto during charges, and production now shifted entirely to this model. By the time the war ended, the Soviet Union had produced some 57,000 T-34s of different variants. It's a staggering number for such a short period, making it the most produced tank of the war. Second place goes to the Sherman and its variants, with just under 50,000. So not even counting all the other tanks and self-propelled guns the Soviets had, the T-34 alone outnumbered all German armored vehicle production combined. And it was that fact, not being the best tank, that played the decisive role in winning the war.